1. The Crucible of Youth, From Obscurity to Ideology, 1889 to 1919. The life that would plunge a continent into darkness began in a quiet Austrian village defined by its proximity to the German Empire. On April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, Adolf Hitler was born into a world of modest, lower-middle-class aspirations, entirely unaware of the catastrophic trajectory his future would take. Braunau, a sleepy town on the border between Upper Austria and Bavaria, was less a place of distinct national identity and more a confluence of German and Austrian culture. This fluid border environment was crucial, subtly imprinting on the young boy the idea of a single, unified German people, irrespective of political boundaries, a greater German Reich, which would later become the core of his political dogma. The backdrop of Hitler's childhood was dominated by the imposing and often cruel figure of his father, Alois Hitler. Born illegitimately and later taking the name of his stepfather, Alois was a self-made man who had clawed his way up to the respected position of a customs official in the Austrian civil service. He embodied the Victorian values of rigid discipline, professionalism, and unquestioning authority. He was not a man given to intellectual pursuits or philosophical musings. His ambition was purely social and material. He demanded from his family, particularly his sons, the same conformity and respect for hierarchy that had defined his career. Alois's ambition for his son Adolf was clear. He was to follow his father into the secure, prestigious career of a civil servant. For the young Adolf, this was not a path, but a prison sentence. Adolf was a daydreamer, a romantic, consumed by the grand mythic histories of the Teutonic tribes and the Wagnerian dramas of heroes and destiny. He possessed a burgeoning arrogance and a deep-seated contempt for the mundane, bureaucratic world his father represented. The resulting conflict was the defining trauma of his youth. The house became a battleground where the authoritarian father relentlessly tried to break the will of the artistic, rebellious son. His resentment was fueled by the stark contrast of his relationship with his mother, Clara. Clara was Alois's third wife and significantly younger. If Alois represented structure and cold authority, Clara represented warmth, devotion, and unconditional affection. She shielded Adolf from his father's worst outbursts and indulged his fantasies, fostering the boy's belief in his own unique, great destiny. Biographers often suggest that the intensity of this bond and the overindulgence by Clara contributed to the later extreme personality traits, a demand for total loyalty and an inability to handle criticism or failure. The peace provided by his mother was shattered by two crucial events. First, the death of Alois in 1903 granted the 14-year-old Adolf a premature freedom. He abandoned the vocational rail school where he was a notoriously poor, insolent student, believing he was now free to pursue his artistic genius. But the second, deeper trauma was the death of Clara from breast cancer in 1907. Her loss left a profound, irreparable void. The young man, who had always defined himself in opposition to the world but in the refuge of his mother's love, was now completely adrift, cut off from his only source of unconditional affection and material stability. He carried this grief and the feeling of being abandoned into a life of aimlessness and poverty. This early period established the foundation of Hitler's later political psychology, a profound hatred of authority rooted in his father, an intense romanticism about Germany's mythical past, and a core instability masked by an aggressive self-belief fostered by his mother. He took a small inheritance and, convinced of his own artistic talent, departed for the glittering cultural center of the Habsburg Empire, Vienna. The glittering imperial city of Vienna for the young Adolf Hitler was a stage upon which his grand artistic dreams were to be realized. Between 1908 and 1913, however, the capital of the vast multi-ethnic Austro-Hungarian Empire delivered a brutal reality check that did more to shape his political worldview than any formal education. It was a period defined by isolation, grinding poverty, and intellectual absorption of the city's toxic political atmosphere. Hitler arrived in Vienna with the arrogance of an untested genius, convinced that the city's Academy of Fine Arts would immediately recognize his unique talent. The reality was a crushing double rejection. In 1907 and again in 1908, his applications were denied. The examiners found his work technically competent in drawing structures and buildings, a talent that reflected his later interest in architecture and grandiose building projects, but completely lacking in the human element and artistic vision necessary for painting. This failure was catastrophic. The rejection confirmed to Hitler not a personal lack of talent, but the conviction that the established academic system was corrupt, inept, or perhaps controlled by forces hostile to true German art. His inability to achieve success in the one field where he placed all his self-worth was a pivotal moment, transforming his internal frustration into externalized hatred. Stripped of his inheritance and unable to commit to steady labor, which he viewed as the snobbish contempt of a failed intellectual, Hitler descended into the lowest strata of Viennese society. He lived for a time in men's hostels, Monernheim, earning a meager living by painting and selling postcards and small watercolors. This poverty-stricken, solitary existence contributed to a bitter intellectual arrogance. Surrounded by the genuinely destitute and unemployed, Hitler retreated into himself, reading voraciously and selectively, creating a fortress of self-justification against the shame of his failure. It was in this crucible of hardship that Hitler encountered the dark heart of Viennese politics, which became his true and most influential schooling. Turn-of-the-century Vienna was a political laboratory, a place where the pressures of nationalism, class conflict, and imperial decline had fermented potent ideologies. Hitler devoured the cheap extremist pamphlets and newspapers that saturated the hostels and public squares. Two figures in particular provided him with the concrete political and ideological tools he would later wield. Karl Lueger, the populist and highly successful mayor of Vienna, demonstrated the power of mass politics built on economic resentment. Lueger's Christian Social Party was openly anti-Semitic, using prejudice against the Jewish community as a cynical yet highly effective political weapon to mobilize the German lower middle class against both the wealthy liberals and the socialist working class. Hitler admired Lueger's masterful oratory and his strategy of framing socio-economic problems in racial terms. George Ritter von Schonerer, a more radical figure, championed pan-Germanism, the reunification of all German speakers under the German flag, and a virulent, racist brand of anti-Semitism that went beyond Lueger's populist political economy. Hitler adopted Schonerer's intense nationalism and his call for the destruction of the Habsburg Empire, which he viewed as a decadent, multiracial mess that was diluting German purity. Through this intellectual self-education, Hitler's pre-existing, unfocused prejudices crystallized into a comprehensive Weltanschauung, or worldview. The Jewish question became in his mind the single, all-encompassing answer to his personal failures and society's ills. The Jews were not merely an ethnic group, but an international, insidious force controlling finance, culture, and socialism, the very forces he felt had corrupted Vienna and stifled his artistic career. This period transformed the socially awkward, failed artist into an ideologue consumed by racial hatred and a political vision of cleansing. By 1913, his 5 years in Vienna had left him physically and emotionally depleted, but ideologically hardened. He had internalized a distinct set of beliefs: the supremacy of the German race, the necessity of a greater Germany, the existential threat posed by the Jewish people, and the political efficacy of populist, emotionally charged mass mobilization. Seeking to escape mandatory Austrian military service, which he opposed due to its multi-ethnic nature, and longing for what he considered his true homeland, Hitler moved across the border to Munich, Bavaria. He was a man with no trade, no real friends, and no prospects, yet armed with a fanatical, fully formed ideology waiting only for an appropriate historical context to explode into action. In 1913, Hitler's move from Vienna to Munich was an act of deliberate self-identification. Bavaria represented the pure, Volkish Germany he worshipped, a place far removed from the decadent cosmopolitanism and political compromises of the Habsburg capital. He was a man without a country, defined by his hatreds and his failed dreams, seeking an anchoring point. When, in August 1914, the long-anticipated conflagration of World War I finally erupted, it provided that anchor, a chance not just for political expression, but for personal and spiritual redemption. Hitler greeted the war with an almost ecstatic fervor. He described the moment he heard the declaration as falling upon my knees and thanking heaven out of the fullness of my heart for granting him the opportunity to live in an age of struggle. He volunteered immediately for the Bavarian army despite being an Austrian citizen and was accepted into the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment, known later as the List Regiment. This was not merely patriotism. For Hitler, the war was a heroic, cleansing struggle, a Volksgemeinschaft, or people's community, where class divisions and ethnic tensions dissolved in the face of a single national cause. He finally found the structure, discipline, and, most importantly, the profound sense of belonging that had been absent throughout his rootless civilian life. Hitler served as a Meldegänger, or dispatch runner, a role far more dangerous than that of an ordinary infantryman, as it required him to constantly traverse the distance between the regimental headquarters and the forward trenches under enemy fire. He performed this duty with fanatical zeal, earning a reputation among his comrades for being unusually brave, intensely devoted, and oddly aloof. He seldom participated in the common soldiers' complaints about food, conditions, or women. He was driven solely by his ideological commitment to the German cause. Paradoxically, the brutal stability of the war was the most fulfilling period of Hitler's early adulthood. It confirmed the heroic destiny he had fantasized about. He was twice wounded, once by a shell splinter in the leg in 1916, but always returned to the front. His conspicuous bravery resulted in the receipt of 2 major decorations, the Iron Cross, Second Class, and in August 1918, the Iron Cross, First Class. The latter award was significant as it was rarely given to a corporal, the rank Hitler held for almost the entire war. The decorations fueled his deep-seated conviction that he was a man chosen by Providence. However, despite his decorations, Hitler remained an outsider. He was generally regarded by his fellow soldiers as an oddity, a man too zealous, too serious, and too politically driven. He avoided personal relationships, and his fanatical political monologues often irritated his comrades, who were far more concerned with survival and the day-to-day misery of trench life. This isolation, combined with his unquestioning loyalty to the general staff, ensured that while he found purpose in the war, he did not find genuine social connection. This separation from the common man's disillusionment with the conflict proved critical. For most of the German army, the final years of the war brought crushing fatigue, declining morale, and a growing recognition of the futility of the fight. But Hitler, cocooned in his ideological fervor at headquarters and convinced of the necessity of victory, experienced the war as a sublime test of national will. This prevented him from internalizing the true extent of the German collapse. He saw every hardship as proof of the enemy's malicious intent and every setback as evidence of treachery at home. The reality of total collapse finally caught up with him in October 1918. During a British gas attack near Werwick, he was temporarily blinded and sent to a military hospital in Pasewalk, Pomerania, far from the front. It was here, confined in a darkened ward, that he heard the news that would shatter his world. The military command had requested an armistice. Germany had surrendered. The military hospital in Pasewalk in the late autumn of 1918 became the birthplace of the future dictator. Recovering from temporary blindness caused by mustard gas, Corporal Hitler was physically isolated from the disintegration of the German state, yet ideologically primed to receive the news of defeat in the most extreme way possible. When a pastor came to the ward to announce that the Kaiser had abdicated, that a socialist republic had been declared, and that the military command had signed an armistice, the effect on Hitler was cataclysmic. For 4 years, the war had been his sole reason for existence, a testament to German will and his own destiny. The surrender was not merely a military loss, it was the annihilation of his personal identity and his national ideal. The emotional impact was so violent that the news allegedly triggered a relapse of his temporary blindness. Lying on his bed, weeping and struggling with his vision, Hitler experienced a profound psychological fracture. In this moment of absolute despair, he found solace and purpose in a ready-made conspiracy theory that was already circulating among right-wing military circles and returning soldiers, the Durchstoßlegende, or the stab-in-the-back myth. The myth provided the perfect rationalization for the failure of the war machine that Hitler had so fanatically devoted himself to. It posited that the German army was not defeated honorably on the battlefield, it was betrayed by internal enemies on the home front, pacifist Jews, Marxist communists, and weak-willed liberal politicians. This insidious narrative transformed a military collapse into a moral crime, absolving the army of defeat and redirecting all national anger and shame towards a specific, definable internal foe. For Hitler, the Durchstoßlegende was a moment of absolute ideological clarity. It married the virulent anti-Semitism he had absorbed in Vienna with the fanatical German nationalism forged in the trenches. He now knew precisely who the enemy was, and the defeat provided him with the mandate for revenge. In his own words, he experienced a kind of religious epiphany. He was called upon by destiny to avenge the betrayal and cleanse the German nation of the traitors responsible. The failed artist and the zealous soldier were subsumed by the nascent political revolutionary. Upon his discharge from the hospital and his return to the tumultuous post-war political landscape of Munich, Hitler was no longer directionless. The trauma of defeat had provided him with a singular, unshakable mission. He remained in the army, which under the newly formed Weimar Republic was struggling to maintain order amidst widespread communist and right-wing paramilitary uprisings. His superiors, recognizing his oratorical skills and fanatical anti-communist stance, assigned him to an educational unit designed to indoctrinate soldiers against socialist and liberal ideas. This assignment was the final, crucial step in his transition from a soldier to a political speaker. It was his first experience of testing his theories on an audience. He discovered a potent, electrifying talent for public speaking, a raw, visceral power to articulate the generalized rage and humiliation felt by the defeated masses. His intense delivery, fueled by genuine personal conviction and years of bottled-up resentment, found a resonant chord with soldiers and workers struggling to make sense of the new chaotic world. In the summer of 1919, while working as an army intelligence agent tasked with monitoring local political groups, Hitler was sent to investigate a small, obscure nationalist organization called the German Workers' Party, DAP. Its platform was rough, nationalistic, and anti-Jewish, a perfect reflection of the ideology he had developed in Vienna and cemented in Pasewalk. Attending a meeting in a beer hall, he was provoked to speak, and his impromptu performance stunned the small audience, including the party's founder, Anton Drexler. This event marked the end of Hitler's military life and the beginning of his political career. The anonymous Corporal First Class had found his platform, his voice, and his path to power. The stage was set for the dark drama of the 1920s. The 30 years of Adolf Hitler, from his birth in 1889 to his entry into the German Workers' Party in 1919, represent the crucial gestational period of a destructive ideology. This era, which began in obscure lower-middle-class Austria and ended in the politically charged turmoil of post-war Munich, was the crucible in which a fragmented, insecure personality was forged into a fanatical political instrument. The period's ultimate significance lies in how various environmental, psychological, and historical factors aligned perfectly to produce the future dictator. The primary environmental factor was the Viennese education in hate. Hitler's personal failure as an artist was seamlessly woven into the city's political tapestry of anti-Semitism and pan-German nationalism. He did not invent these prejudices, but he absorbed them and radicalized them, transforming common social resentment into a totalizing, existential ideology that identified the Jewish people as the singular source of global and national suffering. Vienna taught him not just what to hate, but also how to use that hatred as a unifying political force, witnessed through the populist mastery of Karl Lueger. Psychologically, the period demonstrated a consistent pattern of externalizing failure. Every personal setback, from the failures at the Academy of Fine Arts to the defeat in World War I, was immediately attributed not to his own shortcomings, but to the malicious influence of external hidden enemies. This refusal to accept responsibility was the necessary precondition for his subsequent role as a political leader, who always saw himself as the faultless victim of a conspiracy. Finally, the First World War provided the stage and the substance for his transformation. The trenches gave him discipline, belonging, and a sense of heroic purpose he desperately craved. Critically, the subsequent defeat and the ensuing humiliation of the Weimar Republic provided the fertile ground needed for his extremist seed to sprout. The widespread acceptance of the Dolchstoss legenda meant that a huge, defeated population was ready to believe precisely the narrative of treachery and betrayal that Hitler had forged in the hospital ward at Pasewalk. The war ended his military career, but birthed his political one. By the close of 1919, the 30-year-old former corporal was a political cipher, an anonymous figure in a small, obscure party, yet he possessed three volatile assets that would soon prove decisive. A fully radicalized, comprehensive worldview ready to exploit the chaos, a potent, raw gift of oratory that could channel the collective rage of the dispossessed, and the backing of a defeated army that needed a political voice to articulate its sense of betrayal. The period of obscurity was definitively over. Hitler was no longer the wandering failure of Vienna. He was a driven, political extremist with a singular mission born from the trauma of defeat. The stage was now set for the next chapter of his life, a rapid, terrifying ascent from the beer halls of Munich to the Chancellery in Berlin.
To the Bavarian dynamo, rise of the Nazi movement and the beer hall putsch. 1919 to 1924, Part 1, the smallest stage, discovery and rebranding. 1919-1920, the summer of 1919 found Adolf Hitler operating in the chaotic political ferment of Munich, a city that had replaced Weimar Berlin as the hotbed of German right-wing extremism. Tasked by the Reichswehr's intelligence and propaganda department to monitor local radical groups, Hitler stumbled upon the German Workers' Party, DAP. It was, at the time, a minuscule organization, meeting in the back rooms of beer halls, consisting of perhaps 40 or 50 members drawn from Munich's working class and disgruntled veterans. The DAP's platform was a rough and unfocused blend of nationalism, anti-Semitism, and anti-capitalism. On a rainy evening in September 1919, while attending a DAP meeting at the Sterneckerbräu Beer Hall, Hitler was provoked to speak after a member suggested Bavaria should break away from the Reich. This idea of fragmentation was anathema to Hitler's Greater Germany idealism. He exploded in an impromptu, furious oration against the proposal. The sheer intensity of his delivery, the visceral rage, and the fanatical conviction of his arguments immediately captivated the small audience. The party's founder, Anton Drexler, was stunned. He had found a speaker whose raw power could translate the vague resentments of the crowd into a focused, destructive energy. Drexler quickly extended an invitation to Hitler to join the party. Hitler's decision to join was tactical. He saw the DAP not as an end, but as a vehicle for his now absolute political mission. His first and most crucial contribution was realizing that the party needed to move beyond small, private discussions and become a movement of the masses. He immediately began to focus on propaganda and mass rallies, recognizing that the greatest political power in post-war Germany lay in emotional mobilization, not intellectual debate. Within months, Hitler's energy and organizational skill revolutionized the tiny group. He recognized that the party's appeal needed to be synthesized into a clear, compelling public program. In February 1920, the DAP, driven by Hitler's vision, was renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, the Nazi Party. The term socialist was included strategically to appeal to the vast working class that was then dominated by Marxist parties. Though the socialism of the Nazis was purely nationalistic and racial, utterly divorced from Marxist principles. The same month, Hitler unveiled the 25-point program in the crowded Hofbräuhaus. This document became the movement's foundational creed. It was a cynical but brilliant amalgamation of popular demands. The abolition of the Treaty of Versailles, the demand for a greater Germany uniting all ethnic Germans, the confiscation of war profits, and centrally, the demand that no Jew could be a member of the German nation. The explicit focus on racial exclusion and the repudiation of the peace treaty were the magnetic poles around which the disenfranchised population rallied. The immediate effect of this rebranding and the clear program was explosive growth, particularly in the number of attendees at rallies. Hitler had found his métier. He meticulously choreographed every event, the specific lighting, the deployment of banners, the martial music, and the dramatic, often delayed, entrance of the speaker. This theatrical approach was designed to overwhelm the rationale faculties of the audience, preparing them for the central event, the oration. In the chaos of the Weimar Republic, Hitler was one of the few figures offering a simple, absolute answer, delivered with mesmerizing passion. The beer hall in Munich, previously a place of social gathering, was swiftly transformed into the political arena of a burgeoning radical movement. The maestro of the podium and the rise of the SA. The 1921, with the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, established, Adolf Hitler rapidly shifted the organization from a debating club to a powerful, aggressive political machine. His most potent weapon was his own oratorical skill, which he honed with relentless practice and theatrical staging. Unlike established politicians who spoke in measured tones and complex arguments, Hitler spoke directly to the raw emotions of the masses, their sense of shame, their economic fear, and their nationalist rage over the Treaty of Versailles. His technique was meticulously crafted. Hitler's speeches were never improvised. They were carefully structured crescendos of emotion. He would start slowly, speaking in a low, almost conversational register, allowing the audience to grow restless. Then he would gradually inject hyperbole, utilizing powerful repetitive slogans and crude, easily digestible arguments. Finally, he would unleash a torrent of hysterical, rhythmic fury, often focusing on the Jewish threat and the November criminals, those who signed the armistice. This controlled performance generated a nearly hypnotic collective trance, making the listeners feel not only that they understood the complex problems of the age, but that they were participating in a glorious national uprising. To complement the speeches, Hitler introduced the potent symbolism that would soon become globally infamous. He personally designed the swastika flag, a black swastika in a white circle on a red background. The colors were chosen for their psychological impact. Red for the socialist idea and mass movement, white for nationalism, and black for the Aryan racial struggle. This visual iconography, aggressive and distinct, was essential for building a cult of personality and providing the movement with a recognized brand that stood out in the crowded political field. The NSDAP's confrontational style, however, demanded a physical presence. Many of their meetings were disrupted by political opponents, socialists and communists, leading to violent brawls. To counter this, Hitler created a paramilitary wing in 1921, the Sturmabteilung, SA, or Storm Detachment, initially functioning as mere hall protection. The SA comprised mainly of unemployed soldiers, disillusioned veterans, and roughnecks drawn from the Freikorps, volunteer paramilitary groups, quickly became the shock troops of the Nazi movement. Under the leadership of figures like Ernst Röhm, the SA adopted its recognizable brown shirts, a cast-off uniform originally intended for German colonial troops, and began to operate as a disciplined, intimidating force. The SA served multiple critical functions for the nascent Nazi Party. Security, they protected Nazi rallies and ensured that opposition voices were silenced, often through brutal violence, intimidation. Their mere presence in the streets gave the impression of power and authority, projecting the message that the Nazis were a force to be reckoned with. Recruitment, it provided a place for young, unemployed, and violent men to find camaraderie, uniform, and a sense of purpose, a vital structure missing in the chaotic Weimar era. With the oratorical genius of Hitler driving the message, and the physical force of the SA clearing the way, the party's growth accelerated dramatically. Recognizing the need for a sustained channel of propaganda, Hitler orchestrated the purchase of the local nationalist newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter, the People's Observer. In late 1920, this paper became the official mouthpiece of the NSDAP, allowing Hitler to control the narrative, disseminate his ideology daily, and coordinate the party's message across Bavaria. By the end of 1921, the former corporal had effectively engineered a hostile takeover of the party. He sidelined the original founders, consolidated absolute power, and assumed the title of Führer, leader. Munich was no longer just his home. It was his power base, the Bavarian dynamo, generating a radical movement poised to exploit the mounting political and economic crises of the Weimar Republic. The stage was now set for the next phase, a direct challenge to the authority of the state. 1923. The year 1923 marked the nadir of the Weimar Republic, providing the perfect volatile climate for Hitler's aggressive extremism. The German economy, already reeling from war debts, was plunged into chaos by the catastrophic crisis of hyperinflation. Following Germany's failure to make reparations payments, France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr industrial region in January 1923. The Weimar government responded by calling for passive resistance, printing vast quantities of unbacked currency to support the striking workers. The resulting hyperinflation destroyed the savings of the German middle class, the very demographic that had provided the bedrock of stability. The price of a loaf of bread could rise every hour. Cash became worthless. This economic trauma solidified the populace's contempt for the Republic and intensified the search for political scapegoats, precisely the environment where Hitler's narrative of betrayal flourished. In this atmosphere of national humiliation and economic despair, Hitler saw an unprecedented opportunity. He viewed the passive resistance against the French as weak and called for a German national revolution. Recognizing that the NSDAP, despite its growth, was still too small to seize power alone, he sought to align himself with the established right-wing political elite in Bavaria. Bavaria, with its deep-seated resentment of the central government in Berlin, was ruled by a conservative triumvirate: State Commissioner Gustav von Kahr, commander of the Reichswehr forces in Bavaria, General Otto von Lossow, and State Police Chief Hans Ritter von Seisser. These men, while fundamentally conservative and nationalist, were not revolutionaries. They were part of the establishment. They were engaged in a low-key political standoff with Berlin, but they sought a constitutional restoration of the monarchy, not a radical overthrow. Hitler, however, saw himself as the dynamic force who could compel these hesitant reactionaries into action. He skillfully used his growing popular support, fueled by the hyperinflation crisis, to pressure the Bavarian leaders. His massive, highly organized rallies, backed by the intimidating presence of the brown-shirted SA, made it clear that he controlled the streets and the volatile energy of the masses. He began forming a Kampfbund, fighting league, a loose coalition of all major nationalist and paramilitary groups in Munich, aiming to create a unified force powerful enough to challenge the Berlin government. Crucially, Hitler secured a relationship with one of Germany's most revered military figures, General Erich Ludendorff. The operational architect of Germany's efforts during the First World War, was a towering symbol of traditional German military greatness and had become a committed, if somewhat naive, supporter of right-wing revolutionary causes. His association with the NSDAP gave Hitler an invaluable asset, legitimacy within the military and conservative circles, transforming the Nazi Party from a fringe group into a movement with ties to the nation's heroic past. As the political tension between Munich and Berlin peaked, in the autumn of 1923, Hitler grew impatient. He learned that the Bavarian triumvirate, Kahr, Lossow and Seisser, was planning its own, more conventional coup d'etat aimed at merely replacing the Weimar government. Fearing they would act without him and seize power before the National Socialists could take the lead, Hitler decided to preempt their action. He would force their hands, coercing the established power brokers into joining his revolution. The plan was daring and reckless: to seize Kahr and the other leaders at a major rally, use Ludendorff's prestige to win over the army, and launch a march on Berlin echoing Mussolini's successful March on Rome the previous year. The target was the Bürgerbräukeller beer hall, where Kahr was scheduled to deliver a speech to 3,000 businessmen and government figures on the evening of November 8, 1923. The stage was set for Hitler's first and nearly final gamble for power, the night of the coup and the March of Folly. November 8, 9th, 1923. On the evening of Thursday, November 8, 1923, the atmosphere inside Munich's vast Bürgerbräukeller was thick with the rhetoric of conservative nationalism. State Commissioner Gustav von Kahr was addressing a crowd of roughly 3,000 Bavarian officials and businessmen, outlining his government's conservative platform. Outside, Adolf Hitler and approximately 600 armed, brown-shirted SA men were preparing to launch their revolution. At 8:30 p.m., the moment of action arrived. Hitler, flanked by his associates, stormed the beer hall. Leaping onto a chair, he fired a pistol shot into the ceiling, silencing the massive crowd. "The national revolution has broken out," he yelled. "The hall is surrounded!" He announced the end of the Bavarian and Berlin governments and declared that a provisional national government was being formed. Hitler then commandeered Kahr, Lossow and Seisser, the reluctant triumvirate of Bavarian power, and ushered them into a side room. He frantically attempted to coerce them into joining his rebellion, using a blend of threats and hysterical pleas for national unity. The mood in the hall was initially one of stunned confusion, not revolutionary enthusiasm. The coup needed the immediate, unconditional support of the military and police chiefs to succeed. The situation was briefly salvaged by the dramatic arrival of General Erich Ludendorff. Having been alerted to the coup, the celebrated war hero strode into the beer hall. His presence was intended to legitimize the revolution and sway the military leaders. However, the plan immediately began to unravel. While Ludendorff held the stage, Kahr, Lossow, and Seisser, who had only verbally agreed to support, Hitler, under duress, used the first available opportunity to escape the hall. Once free, they immediately renounced their forced agreements and issued orders to the Reichswehr and police to crush the putsch. The following morning, November 9th, Hitler realized his core strategy had failed. The state apparatus was not his, and the leaders he intended to co-opt were now his enemies. Despite this failure, Ludendorff insisted on marching into the city center, arguing that the soldiers and police would never dare fire upon their heroic general. Hitler, desperately trying to salvage the situation, joined the march. At around 11 a.m., approximately 2,000 Nazi supporters, led by Hitler and Ludendorff, set off to march toward the War Ministry. The procession was a bizarre mixture of armed paramilitaries, political ideologues, and the revered old general. Their intention was to rally further support and force a confrontation. The confrontation came suddenly and violently. As the marchers reached the narrow Odeonsplatz, they were blocked by a cordon of armed Bavarian state police. The two sides approached each other, and in the ensuing confusion, a shot, the source of which remains contested, was fired. A fierce, brief firefight erupted. The violence was brutal and immediate. In a matter of seconds, 16 marchers and 4 police officers lay dead or fatally wounded. Hitler himself was pulled to the ground, dislocating his shoulder as his bodyguard fell mortally wounded beside him. The march scattered instantly. Ludendorff, maintaining a stiff, arrogant composure, walked straight toward the police line and was arrested without resistance. Hitler, however, was quickly pulled away by a car and driven out of Munich to the safety of a friend's house in Uffing. The beer hall putsch was over within 24 hours. It was a spectacular amateurish failure rooted in Hitler's profound misjudgment. He believed that charisma and populist rage could overcome the institutional power of the state. He had learned the power of the masses but failed to understand the power of the state apparatus. The immediate consequence was the collapse of the NSDAP and the issuing of a warrant for Hitler's arrest on charges of high treason. The revolutionary dream had ended, for the moment, in a bloody and humiliating defeat. The trial, Mein Kampf, and the shift to legality, 1924. Following the disastrous beer hall putsch, Adolf Hitler fled, but was arrested 48 hours later. He was charged with high treason against the state and put on trial, alongside Ludendorff and 9 other co-conspirators in February 1924. What should have been a swift and damning conviction for a failed revolutionary turned into a spectacular political triumph for Hitler. The Bavarian judicial system, deeply sympathetic to the nationalist cause and fundamentally hostile to the Weimar Republic, treated the defendants with exceptional leniency. The presiding judge allowed Hitler virtually unlimited time to speak, effectively transforming the courtroom into a political stage. Hitler, recognizing this unprecedented opportunity, seized the moment. He did not attempt to deny his actions. Instead, he declared them to be a patriotic necessity. He framed his treason not as a crime against the German people, but as a necessary act against the November criminals and the despised Treaty of Versailles. His dramatic, 4-hour-long closing speech was a rhetorical masterpiece of defiance. He successfully branded himself as a dedicated German patriot, driven by selfless concern for the nation's fate, while casting the Weimar government as the true villains. The trial gave him the national attention he had previously struggled to achieve with his beer hall speeches. He received a disproportionately light sentence of 5 years in the comfortable Landsberg prison, with the possibility of parole in just 6 months, a sentence designed more for a political celebrity than a revolutionary terrorist. The imprisonment at Landsberg was not a hardship, but a sabbatical. Hitler was granted spacious quarters, was allowed to wear his own clothes, received unlimited visitors, and was given a secretary, Emile Maurice. It was during this period of forced reflection, free from the daily demands of street agitation, that Hitler dictated his defining ideological and autobiographical work. Mein Kampf, My Struggle. Mein Kampf was a dense, often rambling synthesis of his life story. His failures in Vienna, his experiences in the trenches, and crucially, the full, uncompromising articulation of his political and racial ideology. It laid out in chilling detail his 2 major policy goals: the establishment of the Führerprinzip, leader principle, within Germany, and the relentless pursuit of Lebensraum, living space, in the East through the subjugation of Slavic peoples. Most alarmingly, it codified his anti-Semitism into a pseudo-scientific global conspiracy theory, naming the destruction of the Jewish race in Europe as the inevitable objective of the Nazi movement. The writing of Mein Kampf served 2 functions: It provided a definitive, written core doctrine for the scattered Nazi movement, and it allowed Hitler to fundamentally reassess his strategy for seizing power. The failure of the putsch had demonstrated one thing clearly: a street revolution would not work. The institutional power of the German army and the state police was too strong. It was in Landsberg that Hitler made the strategic decision that would irrevocably alter the course of German history. He concluded that power must be achieved legally. He stated, "We must hold our noses and enter the Reichstag. We must use the constitution against the system." The shift was profound. The party would abandon its immediate revolutionary tactics, rebuild its organization, utilize democratic processes, elections, parliament to undermine the state from within, and only seize control once all the legal levers of power were within reach. Released from prison prematurely in December 1924, having served less than 9 months, Hitler emerged not as a chastened failure, but as a recognized national figure armed with a written blueprint for totalitarian rule and a chilling new strategy of legality. The era of the chaotic street brawler was over. The era of the meticulous, calculating political operative was about to begin. The Bavarian dynamo had suffered a tactical explosion, but its core mechanism was now hardened, focused, and ready for a patient, devastating ascent, rebuilding from the ashes the strategy of legality. In 1925-1928, when Adolf Hitler was released from Landsberg prison in December 1924, the political landscape of Germany was fundamentally different from the one he had tried to overturn. The hyperinflation crisis of 1923 had stabilized. The economy was entering a period of relative prosperity known as the Golden Twenties, and the German people, exhausted by the revolutionary fervor, were leaning toward moderation and stability. This was the era of Gustav Stresemann, characterized by international reconciliation and a fragile confidence in the Weimar Republic. Hitler's party, the NSDAP, had fragmented during his 9-month imprisonment. Different factions, led by figures like Alfred Rosenberg and the Strasser brothers, Gregor and Otto, vied for control, and the party's ban remained in force. The task facing Hitler was not merely to revive the party, but to fundamentally rebuild it according to the strategic lesson learned from the failed putsch. The path to power lay not through revolution, but through the strategy of legality. Hitler persuaded the Bavarian authorities to lift the ban on the party in February 1925, assuring them that the NSDAP would respect the law. He then immediately began the process of reasserting his absolute authority as Führer. At the reconstructed First Party meeting in Munich's Bürgerbräukeller, the very hall where the putsch had begun, Hitler delivered a 3-hour speech that brooked no challenge to his leadership. He systematically purged or marginalized rivals who advocated for genuine socialist or revolutionary positions, like the Strasser faction, is cementing the Führerprinzip, the absolute subordination of the entire party to his will. The most critical strategic shift was the creation of a disciplined, hierarchical organizational structure designed to function as a state within a state. The party was organized geographically into Gaue, regions, each controlled by a Gauleiter, a regional dictator directly answerable to Hitler. Below the Gauleiters, the organization extended down through districts, local groups, and individual cells of members who infiltrated factories, villages and towns. This structure ensured that the party was not simply a rally movement, but a pervasive, highly centralized political apparatus capable of operating on a national scale. To prevent the SA from challenging his authority, Hitler created the Schutzstaffel, SS, in 1925, initially conceived as a small elite bodyguard unit. The SS under Heinrich Himmler was designed to be fanatically loyal only to Hitler, serving as a counterweight to the often unruly and ideologically confused SA. The SS represented the future ideological and racial core of the movement. Despite these organizational improvements, the Nazi Party's electoral performance during the mid-20s was poor. In the 1928 Reichstag elections, they won only 2.6% of the national vote, securing just 12 seats. Germany was too stable, and Hitler's extreme rhetoric seemed anachronistic. The party survived the Golden Twenties by focusing on the rural areas and the alienated lower middle class, constantly honing its propaganda skills and building its infrastructure, waiting patiently for the inevitable collapse of the Weimar stability. The strategy was one of patient, aggressive infiltration. Hitler used the democratic rights of assembly and free speech to undermine the very system that protected them. The party's low membership numbers disguised the fanaticism and discipline of the core activists. They were preparing for a time when the economic good times would end, knowing that only a crisis could deliver the popular mandate necessary for them to move from being a fringe movement to a political force. The Great Depression, Hitler's opportunity. 1929-1930, the fragile stability of the Weimar Republic, the Golden Twenties, was abruptly shattered by the global economic catastrophe of the Great Depression. The collapse of the New York stock market in October 1929 triggered a rapid withdrawal of American loans that had been propping up the German economy. The ripple effect was devastating. Industries collapsed. Banks failed and unemployment soared. Within 3 years, over 6 million Germans were out of work, a staggering 1/3 of the workforce. This economic cataclysm was the event Hitler had patiently waited for. The crisis did not create the Nazi movement, but it provided the vast, fertile ground necessary for its growth. The Depression systematically undermined the last remnants of faith in the democratic government and the existing political parties, both centrist and socialist, that were paralyzed by infighting and unable to implement decisive solutions. The Nazis' political fortunes reversed overnight. The economic hardship did not simply affect the working class. It primarily devastated the Mittelstand, the lower middle class, small farmers, shopkeepers, white-collar workers, and artisans. This demographic, previously a pillar of conservatism and stability, saw their life savings, pensions, and social status obliterated. They viewed the crisis not as a mere economic downturn, but as a moral failure of the system, a perfect confirmation of Hitler's decades-old narrative of internal betrayal and international conspiracy. Hitler positioned the NSDAP as the only party with the will and the radical action plan to save Germany. While mainstream parties offered complex solutions, Hitler offered a singular, visceral answer: eliminate the internal and external enemies. This saw the systematic, modern, and comprehensive deployment of Nazi propaganda as a political weapon, largely engineered by the party's brilliant new chief of Goebbels' strategy was centered on two key tenets: simplification and repetition. Complex economic and social issues were reduced to simple, emotional slogans. The enemy was always the same: Jewry, Bolshevism, Weimar, and the Treaty of Versailles. These slogans were repeated tirelessly until they became accepted truths. Targeted messaging. Propaganda was tailored specifically for different groups. To farmers, Hitler promised higher prices and protection from Jewish bankers. To industrialists, he promised an end to trade union power and communism. To the unemployed, he promised work through massive public projects and rearmament. And to the middle class, he promised stability and the restoration of national pride. The most visible manifestation of this new approach was the mass rally. As economic despair deepened, people craved belonging, order, and a shared emotional experience. Nazi rallies provided a choreographed spectacle of discipline, strength, and national unity, standing in stark contrast to the chaotic impotence of the Weimar government. Hitler, arriving in an airplane, the Führer over Germany, became the symbol of a man above the squabbling, broken system. The success of this strategy was immediately apparent in the September 1930 Reichstag elections. In a stunning political earthquake, The NSDAP's vote share skyrocketed from 2.6% in 1928 to 18.3%, transforming them overnight from a fringe party of 12 seats to the second largest party in the Reichstag with 107 seats. The victory was a direct result of the Depression and the strategic exploitation of fear and hopelessness. The Weimar government now faced a massive, aggressively anti-democratic force within the very heart of its parliament. This marked the beginning of the end of parliamentary democracy, as subsequent governments, led by Chancellors Brüning and then Papen, increasingly bypassed the Reichstag, ruling instead through emergency decrees authorized by the aging President Paul von Hindenburg. The political center had collapsed, leaving the field open for the extremists of the right, Nazis, and the left, communists, to engage in a final, brutal contest for power. Terror on the streets and the politics of paralysis, 1930-1932. Following the electoral breakthrough of 1930, Adolf Hitler realized that political victory required not only winning votes, but also controlling the streets. The Nazi movement intensified its reliance on the Sturmabteilung, SA, transforming the paramilitary wing into an army of political disruption and terror. The brown-shirted SA, now numbering in the hundreds of thousands, operated under a dual mandate, providing a theatrical display of Nazi power and brutally crushing political opposition. The SA's street violence was systematic. They initiated clashes with communist and social democrat groups, known as the Red Front, turning German cities into war zones. This calculated aggression served several critical political purposes. Intimidation. It suppressed opposition activity and discouraged voters from attending rival rallies. Order versus chaos. It allowed the Nazis to claim they were the only party capable of restoring order, even though they were the primary cause of the chaos. To the fearful middle class, the SA's brutal discipline looked like the necessary antidote to the perceived anarchy of the Weimar Republic. Appealing to the disenfranchised, the SA offered unemployed men a uniform, camaraderie, and a sense of belonging and power, a solution to their economic and psychological alienation. This atmosphere of perpetual conflict created the necessary environment for the collapse of parliamentary government. Successive chancellors, Heinrich Brüning, Franz von Papen, and Kurt von Schleicher, failed to form stable majorities in the Reichstag, which was now dominated by the anti-democratic extremes, Nazis and communists. As a result, German governance fell into a state of paralysis, relying entirely on Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, the emergency decree power of the president. The decisive political battle of this period was the 1932 presidential election. The 84-year-old incumbent, Paul von Hindenburg, a revered field marshal of World War I, stood for re-election against Hitler and the communist candidate, Ernst Thälmann. Hitler campaigned with unprecedented modernity and intensity. He utilized mass air travel, the Führer over Germany campaign, holding rallies in multiple cities per day, showcasing the Nazi Party's dynamism against the stiff, aging conservatism of Hindenburg. While Hindenburg ultimately won, defeating Hitler in the runoff. The election was a monumental success for the Nazis. Hitler demonstrated that he was a national political force capable of mobilizing millions, capturing over 36% of the vote. The momentum continued. Through the Reichstag elections of July 1932, the Nazi Party achieved its greatest electoral victory, securing 37.3% of the vote and 230 seats, making them the largest party in the Reichstag. Hitler, now controlling the largest faction, demanded the chancellorship. However, President Hindenburg, a deeply conservative Prussian militarist, held Hitler in profound personal contempt, famously referring to him as the Bohemian. Corporal Hindenburg refused to appoint him to the chancellorship, stating he would not give the reins of power to a corporal. Instead, he appointed two non-parliamentary figures, Franz von Papen and later General Kurt von Schleicher, relying on emergency decrees to govern. This period was the most dangerous for the Nazi movement. By the November 1930s Reichstag elections, their vote share dropped to 33.1%, suggesting that their peak had passed and the strategy of permanent campaigning was starting to exhaust the electorate. The party was facing financial crisis and internal divisions were resurfacing. The path to power seemed momentarily blocked by the stubborn intransigence of the president and the state's temporary resilience. The Nazis were at their political and financial limit, needing either to seize power immediately or face a slow, agonizing decline back into obscurity. The backroom coup, the final maneuvers. Late 1932, January 1933. The brief period between the Reichstag elections of November 1933 and January 1933 was a chaotic game of political chess played among a handful of powerful, non-elected elites in the president's circle. The Nazi Party had peaked electorally, but was now facing a severe financial crisis and internal fragmentation. This vulnerability created the precise opening for conservative figures who believed they could use Hitler's mass movement for their own ends. The primary architects of the final deal were Franz von Papen and Alfred Hugenberg. Papen, a former chancellor himself, nursed a deep resentment against his successor, General Kurt von Schleicher, who had engineered Papen's removal. Papen believed that if he could convince the aging President Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as chancellor, he could effectively box Hitler in by surrounding him with conservative, non-Nazi ministers. He famously reassured his allies that within 2 months, Hitler would be so docile they would have squeezed him until he squeaks. The conservatives' calculation was based on a fatal misreading of Hitler's character and the nature of the Nazi movement. They believed Hitler was controllable. They saw him as a charismatic but politically naive populist who could be managed by experienced traditional elites. The Nazis needed them. The party's financial distress and electoral dip suggested they were desperate for a way to power, making them amenable to a coalition dictated by the conservatives. Containment was possible. The cabinet would be structured to hold only 2 other major Nazi figures, Wilhelm Frick as interior minister and Hermann Göring as minister without portfolio, later Prussian interior minister. This minority representation was supposed to ensure conservative dominance. Meanwhile, the sitting chancellor, General Kurt von Schleicher, was trying desperately to maintain power. He attempted a bold move to split the Nazi party by offering a ministerial post to the dissident, Nazi leader Gregor Strasser, who represented the more socialist wing of the party. Strasser briefly considered the offer, leading to a profound crisis within the NSDAP. However, Hitler personally crushed the internal revolt, forcing Strasser's resignation in a dramatic showdown in December 1932. This act of ruthlessness solidified Hitler's absolute command. At the very moment the party was faltering, Schleicher's position quickly became untenable. Facing a hostile Reichstag and unable to secure Hindenburg's support for dissolving the parliament and declaring a military dictatorship, he was forced to resign on January 28, 1933. The path was now clear for Papen's ill-fated scheme. In a series of clandestine meetings at the home of banker Kurt von Schröder, Papen, Hugenberg, and other industrial and political power brokers finalized the terms of the new government. They presented the plan to President Hindenburg, arguing that it represented the last constitutional chance to bring Hitler's mass movement into a controlled, conservative framework. Reluctantly and against his better judgment, Hindenburg yielded to the pressure from his inner circle, particularly his son Oskar and his state secretary Otto Meissner. The men argued that the only alternative was a potential civil war or a communist uprising, which they feared more than a controlled Nazi presence. On January 30th, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg formally appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. The event was hailed by the Nazis as the Machtergreifung, seizure of power, though it was, in reality, a meticulously organized legal maneuver engineered by short-sighted conservative elites. Hitler had not marched on Berlin. He had been invited to walk through the front door of the Chancellery. The Bohemian corporal had legally achieved the second highest political office in the Weimar Republic, ending the era of political maneuvering and opening the door to the swift establishment of the totalitarian state. The fatal miscalculation of the conservatives was that they gave the pyromaniac control of the fire department, believing they could still manage the flames. Adolf Hitler's appointment as Chancellor on January 30th, 1933, marked the end of the Weimar Republic and the beginning of the Third Reich. It was the culmination of 8 years of meticulous strategic planning, demonstrating the ultimate triumph of his strategy of legality. The period from 1925 to 1933 proved that political power in a modern state could be achieved not solely through military force, but through the systematic exploitation of democratic vulnerabilities, combined with relentless modern propaganda and calculated street violence. The conservatives who brought Hitler to power, Papen, Hugenberg, and Hindenburg's Camarilla, believed they had contained the Nazi threat. Their fatal error was mistaking a revolutionary movement for a conventional political party. Hitler's goal was never to share power. It was to monopolize it. Once Chancellor, he moved with lightning speed, using the constitutional tools now at his disposal to dismantle the very system that had elevated him. The initial steps were taken under the guise of restoring order. Hitler immediately demanded and received the dissolution of the Reichstag and the scheduling of new elections for early March 1933. This move was crucial. He needed a popular mandate large enough to legally change the constitution, which required a two-thirds majority in parliament. The atmosphere of the election campaign was one of state-sanctioned intimidation. The two key Nazis in the cabinet, Interior Minister Wilhelm Frick and Prussian Interior Minister Hermann Göring, used their control over the police to authorize the SA and SS to act as auxiliary police. This effectively legalized Nazi street terror, turning the state's apparatus of enforcement against the Nazi party's political opponents. Opposition meetings were banned or broken up. Communist leaders were arrested, and the press was silenced. The pivotal event that sealed the fate of the Republic was the Reichstag fire on February 27, 1933. The Reichstag building was gutted by fire, though historical debate continues over the precise perpetrators. The Nazis immediately blamed a communist conspiracy. Hitler and Göring seized the opportunity, claiming the fire was the signal for a Bolshevik revolution. Using the alleged emergency, Hitler pressured President Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree on February 28, 1933. This decree was the first and most devastating blow to Weimar democracy. It suspended all the fundamental civil liberties guaranteed by the Constitution, including freedom of speech, assembly, and the press. It effectively established a permanent state of emergency, allowing the Nazis to jail political opponents, especially communists, without charge, suppress newspapers, and ban opposition rallies. This was the moment the rule of law was replaced by the rule of terror. Despite the intimidation, the March 1933 elections gave the Nazis only 43.9% of the vote. This was a strong showing, but still short of the two-thirds majority needed to permanently change the constitution. Hitler needed the votes of other parties. His final maneuver was the passage of the Enabling Act, Ermächtigungsgesetz, on March 23, 1933. This law proposed to transfer the legislative power of the Reichstag to the Chancellor Hitler and his cabinet for 4 years, allowing them to enact laws without parliamentary consent, even laws that violated the Constitution. Hitler secured the necessary two-thirds vote through a combination of intimidation and political deals. The communist deputies, already imprisoned under the fire decree, were excluded from the vote. The SA surrounded the Reichstag meeting, using menacing displays of force. Hitler gained the crucial support of the Catholic Center, Party by promising falsely to respect the rights of the Church and the autonomy of the German states. The Enabling Act passed with overwhelming support. This single vote formally ended parliamentary democracy in Germany. The Weimar Constitution was not formally abolished, but it was rendered completely irrelevant. Hitler now possessed the absolute legal authority to rule by decree, without legislative or presidential oversight. The 8-year path to power was complete. Hitler had moved from an obscure street orator to the supreme political authority in Germany, using legality as a cloak for revolution. The period of transition was over. The totalitarian state was born, poised to embark on the catastrophic policies laid out a decade earlier in Mein Kampf.
Adolf Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in January 1933 marked the end of the democratic struggle and the beginning of a swift, ruthless revolution from above aimed at dismantling the old German state structure and establishing the Führerprinzip, the absolute, unquestioned leadership principle. The initial months were characterized by a flurry of legislative and terrorist actions known collectively as Gleichschaltung, coordination, designed to bring every facet of German life under Nazi control. The foundations for this totalitarian state were laid within weeks of Hitler taking office. As detailed in the previous chapter, the Reichstag Fire Decree, February 1933, instantly curtailed civil liberties, but the Enabling Act, Ermächtigungsgesetz, March 1933, was the crucial legislative coup. By granting the Chancellor the power to enact laws without parliamentary consent, and even laws that contradicted the Constitution, the Enabling Act legally suspended the democratic framework of the Weimar Republic. Hitler was now a dictator operating under the temporary guise of law. With this new power, the Nazi regime moved rapidly to eliminate political opposition. Trade unions were abolished and replaced by the German Labor Front, DAF. All other political parties, from the Communist Party, KPD, to the conservative nationalist parties that had initially aligned with Hitler, were either banned or pressured into self-dissolution. In July 1933, the Nazi party NSDAP was declared the only legal political party in Germany, making the one-party state a reality. State governments, the Länder, were stripped of their authority and brought under the control of Nazi Reich governors Reichsstatthalter, crushing the last remnants of federalism. However, the greatest threat to Hitler's absolute authority came not from his opponents, but from within his own movement, specifically from the massive Sturmabteilung, SA. By 1934, the SA, under the leadership of Ernst Röhm, numbered over 3 million men and was far larger and better equipped than the regular German army, Reichswehr. Röhm and his followers, advocating for a second revolution, demanded that the SA replace the professional army and that the more radical, anti-capitalist promises of the Nazi program be implemented. This demand put Hitler in direct conflict with the traditional pillars of the German state whose support he still needed. The Reichswehr, the army, and the conservative industrial and political elite. The army high command, viewing the SA as an undisciplined mob, made it clear that they would only pledge their loyalty to Hitler if the SA threat was eliminated. Hitler chose the army. The purge, known as the Night of the Long Knives, Nacht der langen Messer, unfolded from June 30 to July 2, 1934. Hitler, using the elite Schutzstaffel SS under Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, launched a calculated, bloody operation. Röhm and hundreds of other SA leaders, along with old political rivals like former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher and conservative figures who had displeased the regime, were executed without trial. The purge achieved two vital objectives. It eliminated the SA as a political force, transferring its authority to the SS, and it secured the loyalty of the army. The army, relieved that the SA threat was gone, stood silent. The final piece of the consolidation puzzle fell into place with the death of President Paul von Hindenburg in August 1934. Within hours, Hitler abolished the office of the president and merged its powers with the office of the chancellor, declaring himself Führer und Reichskanzler, leader and Reich Chancellor. This action completed the Gleichschaltung and cemented the Führerprinzip. All executive, legislative, and military authority was now vested in a single person, Adolf Hitler, whose power was boundless and unchallengeable. The totalitarian structure was complete. With the Führerprinzip firmly established, the Nazi regime turned its attention to the two core objectives of Hitler's Weltanschauung, worldview, implementing the racial state and preparing Germany for aggressive war. These twin goals drove domestic policy, economics, and legal doctrine throughout the mid-1930s. The establishment of the racial state began with a campaign of systematic legal discrimination against German Jews. While persecution had been continuous since 1933, the effort became formalized and codified in September 1935 with the passage of the Nuremberg Laws. These two laws fundamentally redefined German citizenship. The Reich Citizenship Law. This law stripped Jews of German citizenship, classifying them merely as state subjects, thus denying them all political rights. The law for the protection of German blood and German honor. This law prohibited marriages and extramarital relations between Aryans and Jews, criminalizing racial mixing and formalizing the regime's biological racism. The Nuremberg Laws were the legal culmination of years of ideological agitation. They excluded Jews from participation in national life, encouraged segregation, and provided the legal framework for intensified economic persecution. The laws were not an endpoint, but a milestone, signaling to the world and to the German populace that the state was fully committed to the persecution of the Jewish minority, an ideological commitment far surpassing any immediate economic or political goal. Parallel to this racial revolution, the regime embarked on a massive, secretive program of rearmament. Hitler's aggressive foreign policy, aimed at achieving Lebensraum, living space in the East, depended entirely on military power, which meant openly defying the Treaty of Versailles. In March 1935, Hitler publicly renounced the disarmament clauses of the treaty and announced the reintroduction of conscription, military service, and the dramatic expansion of the German army, the Wehrmacht. This announcement was met with only mild diplomatic condemnation from Britain and France, confirming Hitler's belief that the Western powers lacked the will to enforce the treaty. To finance this military buildup without immediately bankrupting the nation, the economic genius of H. Hjalmar Schacht, the president of the Reichsbank and Minister of Economics, was crucial. Schacht employed unorthodox and complex financial schemes, most notably the use of MIFO bills. These were government-backed promissory notes that allowed the state to secretly funnel vast amounts of money into rearmament contracts without showing the expenditure on the official state budget. This masked the true extent of military spending from both domestic and international observers, allowing the rearmament program to proceed at a staggering pace. The economic recovery, fueled by massive government spending on infrastructure, like the autobahns and military production, solved the unemployment crisis that had plagued the Weimar Republic. This economic success, coupled with the restoration of national pride through rearmament, provided the regime with immense domestic popularity. Many ordinary Germans, benefiting from the new employment and feeling a renewed sense of German greatness, accepted the internal repression and persecution as a necessary price for order and national revival. By 1936, the totalitarian state was a formidable reality. Political opposition was neutralized. The economy was geared toward war. The military was being rebuilt, and the ideological groundwork for future aggression and genocide was firmly established. The stage was set for Hitler's foreign policy gambles, which began with the first open breach of a major international agreement. The consolidation of totalitarian control at home was immediately paired with a revolutionary and aggressive foreign policy designed to smash the post-war international order established by the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler's strategy was characterized by audacity, timing, and a deep psychological understanding of the Western powers' paralyzing fear of another war, a policy later termed appeasement. Hitler's first major international challenge came swiftly. In October 1933, Germany announced its withdrawal from the League of Nations and the World Disarmament Conference. This move, framed domestically as an act of asserting German equality and sovereignty, was a clear signal that Germany would no longer be bound by international protocols it deemed restrictive. While the move was diplomatic, it was highly popular at home, fueling the narrative that Hitler was the restorer of German dignity. It was the first time a major power had openly defied the League, exposing its impotence. The next major gamble came in March 1936 with the remilitarization of the Rhineland. The Treaty of Versailles and the subsequent Locarno treaties had declared the region bordering France and Belgium a demilitarized zone. Hitler, acting against the advice of his own generals, ordered a small contingent of Wehrmacht troops to march into the zone. He gambled that France, paralyzed by political instability, and Britain, focused on its own empire and convinced that Germany was merely moving troops into its own territory, would not respond with force. The gamble paid off completely. No military action was taken by the Western Allies. This success was a psychological victory for Hitler, proving his intuition that force and defiance, rather than diplomacy, were the keys to reasserting German dominance. It also solidified his prestige within the Wehrmacht and among the German populace, making him appear infallible. The failure of France and Britain to enforce the treaty in 1936 was arguably the last chance to stop Hitler without triggering a major war. Simultaneously, the Nazi regime accelerated its economic preparation for a sustained, aggressive military campaign. In 1936, Hitler dismissed the cautious economic policies of Hjalmar Schacht, who warned that the breakneck pace of rearmament would lead to financial instability. Hitler replaced him by initiating the four-year plan, placing Hermann Göring in charge. The four-year plan had one overriding objective: to make Germany autarkic, economically self-sufficient, and to fully prepare the Wehrmacht for war within 4 years. This involved industrialization for war, focusing all capital investment on key strategic industries: steel, explosives, synthetic fuels, and rubber. Raw material substitution, developing synthetic materials to replace imported resources, ensuring the nation could sustain a war despite a naval blockade. Labor control, imposing strict control over the German workforce and resource allocation to ensure military priorities were met. The aggressive nature of Hitler's plans was made chillingly clear in November 1937 at the Hossbach Conference. In a secret meeting with his top military and foreign policy chiefs, Hitler explicitly laid out his timeline and objectives. Germany needed to acquire Lebensraum in the east by force, beginning with the seizure of Austria and Czechoslovakia in the immediate future. The minutes of this meeting, recorded by Hitler's adjutant Friedrich Hossbach, reveal that Hitler was driven not by rational military planning, but by an ideological imperative and a fixed timetable for war. By 1937, Germany had fully escaped the shackles of the Versailles Treaty. Hitler had successfully replaced international cooperation with unilateral aggression, transforming a defeated republic into a seemingly invincible military and industrial power. The groundwork was complete, and the focus shifted from domestic consolidation and secret rearmament to the overt execution of his ideological foreign policy objectives in Central Europe. The first targets, Austria and Czechoslovakia, were already marked. The years 1938 and 1939 represented the apex of Hitler's early foreign policy success, achieved through diplomatic bluff and the paralyzing Western policy of appeasement. Having consolidated all power under the Führerprinzip, he moved to execute the territorial expansion necessary for Lebensraum, beginning with his native Austria. The Anschluss, annexation of Austria in March 1938, was a profound ideological and strategic victory, driven by the pan-German nationalism he had fostered since his youth. Hitler first used political intimidation, forcing the Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg to appoint Nazis to key cabinet posts. When Schuschnigg called for a popular vote on Austrian independence, Hitler intervened with military force. The Wehrmacht marched into Austria to overwhelming domestic support from many Austrian citizens who welcomed the idea of a greater Germany. The annexation was swift, bloodless, and absolute. Austria was absorbed into the Reich, providing Germany with immediate access to significant gold and foreign currency reserves, raw materials, and an additional 7 million German-speaking citizens for the Wehrmacht. The Western powers protested weakly but took no substantive action, once again confirming Hitler's belief that they would capitulate rather than fight. The Anschluss demonstrated that Hitler was willing to use military force, even if bloodlessly, to achieve his revisionist goals. The next target, as planned in the Hossbach Memorandum, was Czechoslovakia. Hitler focused on the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia bordering Germany that housed approximately 3 million ethnic Germans and, critically, contained the nation's vital industrial fortifications. The Czech government, backed by alliances with France and the Soviet Union, was determined to resist, but Hitler manufactured a crisis, claiming the ethnic Germans in the Sudetenland were being persecuted. The crisis peaked in September 1938. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain intervened, flying to Germany 3 times to negotiate with Hitler. The resulting Munich Agreement was the high-water mark of appeasement, signed by Germany, Italy, Britain, and France, but notably excluding Czechoslovakia. The agreement forced the Czechs to surrender the Sudetenland to Germany in exchange for a promise from Hitler that this would be his last territorial demand. Chamberlain returned to London, famously declaring he had secured peace for our time. The Munich Agreement was a strategic disaster for the Allies and a geopolitical triumph for Hitler. It crippled Czechoslovakia, stripping it of its defensible border fortifications and industrial capacity, leaving it militarily helpless. The final act of aggression before the outbreak of general war occurred 6 months later. In March 1939, Hitler completely disregarded the Munich Agreement by ordering the full occupation of the rest of Czechoslovakia. Czech President Emil Hácha was coerced into signing over the country, which was divided into the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. This action was different from previous moves. The seizure of non-German populations finally proved to the skeptical Western powers that Hitler's goals were not limited to uniting German people, but were aimed at full territorial conquest and domination. The occupation of Czechoslovakia finally forced a change in Western policy. Britain and France realized that Hitler could not be trusted and that his ambitions were boundless. They issued a firm guarantee to Poland, stating that if Germany attacked Poland, they would declare war. This diplomatic shield for Poland directly set the stage for the final crisis. Hitler, emboldened by years of successful bluffs, did not believe the Allies would honor their commitment. His final and most cynical maneuver was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, in August 1939. This agreement, signed with ideological rival Joseph Stalin, secretly divided Poland between Germany and the Soviet Union, neutralizing the threat of a two-front war. With the Soviet threat removed and convinced the Western powers were weak, Hitler gave the final order. The Führerprinzip was ready to be unleashed on the world. At dawn on September 1, 1939, the German military invaded Poland, triggering the declaration of war by Britain and France. The totalitarian state, built over 6 years of ruthless coordination and audacious foreign policy gambles, had achieved its purpose: war.